Russia is about to make its most consequential decision in years, definitely since the fall of 2022, and maybe even going back to the initial decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of that year. Indeed, the Kremlin must choose whether to mobilize a much larger force to involuntarily head to Ukraine. Or at least that is what Kyiv insists will be happening in 2 short months. Successfully executing the mobilization will firm up Russian weaknesses along parts of the front line, allow Russia to push forward on other parts of the front line, and maybe even launch a new attack vector. Fumbling the execution will leave Russia economically crippled at best, and at worst may result in Vladimir Putin's fall from power. However, because this is the world of geopolitics, not everything may be as it seems. Hence, today, we must take a deep dive into political military strategy and the disinformation campaigns that arise in this field. But we may be watching Ukraine's own game underway, which could catalyze the problems that Russia seeks to avoid, yet might simultaneously cause the exact problems that Ukraine seeks to avoid. So, today, we will cover this topic in 4 phases. First, I will give you the background of the claim about mobilization, what may be happening, when it may happen, and why Russia would want to do it. Then we will examine why Ukraine is so keen to publicize this upcoming mobilization, or alleged mobilization. And for those of you who have been with me for years, yes, we will be tapping the sign. Yet this strategy comes with an inherent risk, where, if it is effective, but Putin is in firm political control of Russia, the whole thing may end up backfiring. We will examine why that could be the case, and the conditions necessary for that effect. Finally, we will look inside Ukraine for hints that the mobilization warning may be sincere, and connect it to the political scandal that broke there last week. But let's start with an overview of the mobilization claim. In short, Ukraine says there is a high risk of Russia mobilizing as many as 500,000 men to serve in Ukraine. The timeline here is coming up as soon as 2 months from now. That corresponds to the end of Russia's parliamentary elections, which conclude on September 20th. As we will discuss in much greater detail in a moment, mobilization would be an unpopular policy in the country, and thus the Kremlin would not want to announce it until after the votes have been cast. I know that this may seem strange because Russia is an increasingly authoritarian country, but there are still limits on Putin's power and grip over the population. Even elections with predetermined winners are concerning to autocrats, because the election itself can be a call to coordinated protests by citizens. You can even see the limits of the Kremlin's power in the mobilization procedure itself. I said a moment ago that these soldiers would be mobilized to Ukraine. In fact, according to Russian law, they would be mobilizing to Russian Federation land that just so happened to previously be Ukrainian territory before the signatures were made on these pages that you are looking at now. It is a quirk of Russian conscription, where by law those soldiers can only deploy to defend Russian territory. As for where, Ukraine warns that some will immediately head to the Eastern Front within 2 weeks of mobilization. This would presumably be on the southern end, where Russia has been on its heels for a few months, thanks to Ukraine's influx of counter-logistic strikes in the region. As for the remainder, who will receive more training, the easy thing for them to do would be to go to the northern side of the main front, to more rapidly push toward Kharkiv. A more creative approach that would require some tweaking of Federation law would be to send them to create a new front heading south from Belarus toward Kyiv. Because that worked so well the last time. The final floated possibility, with even more liberally created new laws required, would be to attack the Baltics. Perhaps you detected my skepticism about that last one. Given all of the reporting on the subject, we should spend some time discussing the credibility of the claim. So, is it true? You will notice that the story has not broken through to mainstream outlets yet, indicating that there is a degree of skepticism here. Instead, regionally interested outlets like the Kyiv Post and militarily focused outlets like War on the Rocks brought the topic into focus. I know this thanks to the returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Beyond merely tracking breadth of coverage and outlet bias, the blind spot feature from Ground News also highlights the stories that each side of the political divide misses out on, like the right overlooking the new British Prime Minister's phone call to Zelensky, and the left ignoring the quantity of oil that Iran exported during the ceasefire that was not a ceasefire. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps, or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan, which gives you access to all of these features and more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Okay, back to the key question. Are these claims true? Maybe, but the claims themselves are not going to sway my opinion one way or another. What we have on our hands is yet one more situation where it is best not to listen to what leaders say. Suppose for a moment that the claims are true, and that toward the end of September, the Kremlin will put out the call to mobilize. Ukraine would want to make that as difficult as possible for Russia to execute, which means getting as many Russian men as far away from Russia as possible. These public declarations serve as warnings to those potentially affected. They need to get their escape plans into place now, or proactively leave the country so that they are not caught off guard. Switching perspectives for a second, the clear downside to mobilizing for the Kremlin is how economically disruptive it would be. Yes, technically you would no longer be paying out voluntary contracts, so it might look like a line of savings on the federal budget. But those 500,000 people will suddenly no longer be working and paying into the economy. Anyone who has a job tied to their work will also find themselves struggling. And the government will still be on the hook to equip and arm all of those new soldiers. It may be short-term cheaper to force mobilization rather than raise contract wages, but there are some serious long-term economic downsides. The other downside, which we will discuss in greater depth in a moment, is the political instability that said involuntary deployments would cause. Protests on the streets, threats to the existing regime, and so forth. If you are struggling to recruit enough men on voluntary contracts, despite massive cash offers from the perspective of an average Russian, it tells you something about just how much those people do not want to go to Ukraine. Russia continues to offer those contracts, telling us that, at least for now, forced recruitment is a worse outcome. Circling back to Kyiv's perspective, if you can trigger that economic upheaval and that political crisis without Russia even having chosen to initiate a mobilization, then that seems like a free win. Okay, well, how might you go about instigating those responses? By convincing everyone that mobilization could happen any day now. In turn, Ukraine's message does not have inherent credibility. Regardless of whether it is true, it appears that Kyiv would want to communicate the same message. That is why these stories pique my interest, but I am not immediately confident what I should believe. This is, more or less, how NATO governments have viewed the idea that Russia might attack a Baltic country before the end of the year. The notion is absurd, but it might stir up pro-Ukrainian sentiment among allied nations. That would not be the worst outcome, and it would also not hurt if it increased support for allied military spending, as NATO is very much concerned about a Russian attack in 4 years or so, after the Kremlin has taken a breather from the war in Ukraine. That said, I should note that Russia might want to have more troops stationed along the border if Russian special forces attempt an irregular and provocative attack, as intelligence has suggested is a real possibility in Poland. But this is different from the suggestion that Ukraine has made, which is why Ukraine's specific declaration of an attack on NATO is dismissed as uninformative messaging. Anyway, I will discuss a more reliable signal in a moment, but I think we should first address a potential way that this could backfire for Ukraine. Again, mobilization inside of Russia would be an incredibly unpopular policy. Indeed, it caused so much resistance back in the fall of 2022 that the Kremlin had to backtrack on it for fear of protesters in the streets. What is unclear to us as observers is just how insecure Putin is in his position. If he thinks that he is hanging by a thread, then he would be unlikely to call for a mobilization under any circumstance. This is ideal for Ukraine's apparent strategy, as it can, at minimum, give the Kremlin one more thing to worry about, and at maximum, spark the uprisings that Ukraine would generally want. In contrast, imagine that Putin feels moderately insecure. Well, a Putin that really wants to win the war in Ukraine might find mobilization tempting. The drawback, though, is that the economic damage to the country and some moderate risk of someone forcing him out of office will go up. Do you see where this is going? Suppose that Ukraine's warnings strike a nerve among average Russians. Those who can, flee. Those who cannot, begin protesting. Well, think again about the disincentive for the Kremlin to mobilize. It was 1. Economic damage to the country, but some portion of that has already come to pass. It was 2. Political instability, but now the protesters are already out there. The Kremlin now has a good idea about just how much of a threat they pose to the regime. It is possible, then, that the Kremlin calculates that mobilizing is now worthwhile, even though it was not at the start. Ukraine effectively causes the problem that it seeks to limit. I do not know how comfortable Putin feels currently. I have expressed my skepticism before that he is just barely clinging to power, and that he desperately needs to turn the tide in Ukraine to be able to politically survive. If anything, the oligarchs in Russia would take one giant sigh of relief when the war ends, as they can go back to making money. I have also expressed my skepticism that mobilizing would be a good solution to this problem, regardless of Putin's grip on power. Again, the economics of the situation are just horrible, and I do not think that calling for a Hail Mary in the form of mobilization is a better solution. Remember, those hundreds of thousands of new soldiers also need equipment. The Kremlin cannot solve that problem by also conscripting 1 million workers to clock in at factories and donate their unpaid labor. Nonetheless, I would have to reconsider my beliefs if Putin does indeed pull the trigger. One interpretation, and I am sure the one that will become the prevailing narrative, is that Putin is so desperate that he had no choice but to pull the trigger. However, you could also explain the move as a function of Putin's grip on power being so tight that true political risks are minimal compared to what he may stand to gain from the influx of manpower. Neither of those conclusions seems reasonable given what we know, which is why announcing the mobilization would be so strange. As a final thought for today, I do not think that everything that we have observed on this front from Ukraine is pure cheap talk. You may be following the ongoing scandal in Kyiv regarding Zelensky's dismissal of Minister of Defense Mikhailo Fedorov. Fedorov was popular in the country, but had a falling out with the head of Ukraine's military, General Alexander Syrsky. The public-facing explanation is that Fedorov was ineffective at recruiting for the front lines, which Ukrainian commanders believe is the appropriate countermeasure to a Russian mobilization. That led to a rift between the two camps, with Zelensky ultimately siding with Syrsky. In turn, Fedorov's dismissal is a costly signal that Ukraine's claims regarding mobilization are true. You would not want to dismiss a popular and effective minister, especially on the technical side of the war, if there was not another pressing concern. Just a reminder that, by all accounts, Fedorov is primarily responsible for Ukraine's momentum in the south. Still, we should not treat this as proof positive that mobilization is truly on the minds of Ukrainian policymakers. Fedorov's departure may also be the result of internal politics, and this serves as a convenient cover story. As ever, we, as outsiders, remain in the dark and have to wait for more information to better understand what is happening. I also need to note that the protests continue as I write this, and there is plenty of speculation that Zelensky will soon replace Syrsky as well. Indeed, it may very well have happened by the time that you watch this video. If so, I do not think that this changes how we should interpret the above costly signaling argument. This is the Zelensky administration implementing damage control, having significantly underestimated Fedorov's popularity, even if the prevailing sentiment within the country's security forces is that Ukraine needs to take more heavy-handed preemptive measures. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? Ukraine is adamant that Russia is serious about mobilizing. There are significant incentives to misrepresent what Ukraine's actual intelligence says on the subject, which is why we should be looking toward other signals. The current cabinet shuffles offer some insight there, but nothing firm. And there is some risk that this will all backfire for Ukraine. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan. Meanwhile, you can head over to my secondary channel to watch a related video on trying to sort through the claims that Russian soldiers only survive 30 minutes on the front lines. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.